To another edition of Alternatives, the Access Television Forum that provides a showcase for creative talent in our local area. With us now is author Ron Felber. Ron has written 5 novels and 2 nonfiction books, including Searchers, A True Story, and was the recipient of the UPI Press Award for Short Stories in 1969. Ron Felber is also the president and CEO of Chemitol Oakite, a specialty chemical manufacturer based in Berkeley Heights, New Jersey. Ron received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Georgetown University and his Master's of Business Administration from Loyola University in Chicago. In his latest manuscript, The Privacy War, Neil Gallagher and the Hoover-Kennedy Vendetta is a compelling expose on how our private information can be manipulated to suit the will of others seeking control or financial gain. Opening the manuscript, Felber poses the question: what if you woke up one morning and realized that the country you thought you were living in and fought for during your entire life didn't exist? Will the latest innovations in digital technology keep us safer, or redefine the definition of personal freedom and civil rights? Ron, thank you for being with us and to comment on privacy and your personal conversations with former New Jersey Congressman Neil Cornelius Gallagher.
My pleasure.
Ron, let's start off the interview with exactly who was Cornelius Neil Gallagher?
Well, this is a man whose personal history and professional history has almost been erased, and that's because of basically a government scheme or plan by J. Edgar Hoover and others, Deke Deloge, to put him out of the history books. But really, this is a truly important figure in many ways, particularly in the area of privacy, which these days with the Al-Qaeda, bin Laden, September 11th, etc., becomes more and more important. As most people do not know, this is not a new issue. And as far back as 1966, Neil Gallagher was heading up a subcommittee on the issue of privacy. Neil Gallagher was elected to Congress in 1958. He represented an area of Hudson County, primarily Jersey City and Bayonne. And he came up as a war hero. Actually, his father was a war hero, the most decorated man.
Tradition, democratic enclave, absolutely. Democratic values.
Absolutely.
Very democratic area.
The most decorated man in the history of the town was his dad. Really? His father had held off a machine gun, Nazi forces in World War I, the machine gun, had his arm blown off and actually was gassed, so he lost a lung. He came back a war hero, and that influenced Neil Gallagher, Cornelius Gallagher, the son, a lot. His father died shortly thereafter. But to show you the kind of community that Bayonne is and was, they made him an honorary detective, the father, to help support the family and a struggling family, and again, a war hero, a town hero. Neil Gallagher is a brilliant man. He is alive today, and that's just wonderful, because I think he gets to see his reputation vindicated with this book, and I also think he gets to talk about probably the most compelling issue of the day, which is privacy. He was best friends with John Kennedy, got in, again, as a war hero himself. Neil Gallagher was decorated with 3 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star Medal, and a Silver Star Medal for heroics in World War II. Got a law degree, graduated #1 in his class, and then ran for Congress and got to be very good friends with the Kennedys.
What were some of his political positions that were, I guess, popular, or that he was really trying to spearhead in his early career?
Well, he was really one of the champions of civil rights. And this I can tell you as a fellow that spent 3 years almost living with the Gallagher family.
Really?
I wrote the book actually in an attic room that they had. I have 3 children myself, and it gets a little noisy. So to do a book and to do this kind of writing, you really want to concentrate and do a lot of research. So a lot of the writing I did at his home. And Neil Gallagher is an incredibly honorable man, in my view, and he's a person that has a great sense of fairness. And based on that, civil rights, early along, way before it was fashionable,
so
was his cause.
I'm getting the impression that he struggled and believed in true American values. And when he saw some of these true American values being more or less stomped on, he tried to do something.
Yeah. You know, that opening quote that you used, what if you woke up one day and found that the country you thought you were living in didn't exist, really sums it up. Here's a man who not only was 40% disabled from World War II, but re-upped for the Korean War. Now, you know, I'm as patriotic as the next fellow, but I don't think I'd have done that. I don't think there are many men that would have. So he wound up serving in Korea. He didn't go to Korea, but he wound up being an instructor in military science during the Korean War. Gave up a lucrative law practice. Again, this was a fellow that had graduated #1 in his law school.
Right.
So had a brilliant career, a war hero, etc. Went re-upped. So he's an incredibly patriotic man. And what he found after he was elected to the Congress was more than stomping on rights or being passive or neutral or amoral. What he found was absolute savagery. And he was shocked to the point where the quote that he gave me actually on a tape was, you know, what if you lived your whole life believing in these ideals and then all of a sudden went to Washington of all places and found that that the very people you fought, let's talk about the Nazi regime and the Third Reich, that many of the practices that they were putting into effect that were so abhorrent were actually being done by our government to our people.
It's kind of hard to swallow at that point. How did you come to meet Neil Gallagher?
It was an
How did you just pop into him on a street corner? Or?
No. I had written a book called Searchers, which St. Martin's put out, I think, back in '96 or so. And I wrote another book after that, which didn't do as well. It was called Crossover. And I was a member of the Bayonne Writers Group, which is a pretty solid group. And I had the good fortune to get an award from for this new book, Crossover it was called. So a friend of mine, longtime friend, was there to see me get the award. Afterwards, we had a cocktail. Hadn't seen him in years. And I told him the new project I was working on was a fiction book. I was going to call it Organogram. It was about the Kennedy assassination. And he said, you know, if you're doing research on this, I know a man that was very, very good friends with John Kennedy. Would you like to meet him? Of course, I did meet him. By the time I got through spending a couple of hours with Neil Gallagher, I realized that my fiction book couldn't hold a candle to his true life story.
Yeah. It must be something to hear true life stories coming from a political figure larger than a city council or a mayor or something like that. You really feel that these people are in the true sanctum of power.
That's very true. You've got to realize that Neil Gallagher at that time was considered for the vice presidential position on the 64 ticket for Johnson.
Really?
So this was a guy that had gravitated way, way up. And again, I guess people look at themselves, look at their own backgrounds. But John Kennedy, Irish Catholic, war hero, new generation of political leaders. Neil Gallagher was exactly that, exactly that. So they hit it off from the get-go. And as a matter of fact, Neil Gallagher was the first person to endorse Kennedy for the presidency outside of Massachusetts.
Really?
Yeah.
Ron, why the privacy wars, and who's fighting, and what is at stake?
You know, it's much deeper and much more complex than a listening device or a warrantless search or an echelon spy system that the NSA might have, or carnivore, renamed these days. The FBI might have to monitor ATM transactions, telephones, cell phones, those kinds of things, electronic devices. It's much deeper than that. And if you go back to a little history with Germany, or with the Taliban, for example, in Afghanistan, things don't just happen like that. They happen in a gradual way, like water rising.
Right, yeah.
And before you know it, you're drowning. And in a lot of cases, I think what Gallagher's struggle in the mid-60s up till 72 when he was in prison for the first time shows the absolute abuse of power. People tend to think of their leaders, and idealism is a wonderful thing, as being benevolent. But what if they're not?
Exactly.
What if J. Edgar Hoover, for example, who the world basically turned over all the power he wanted to,
right,
who's blackmailing congressmen, blackmailing senators, had the Senate caucus room bugged.
Well, he himself was being blackmailed.
That's correct. He was blackmailed by organized crime, the mafia, and that's a pretty known fact. As a matter of fact, an acquaintance of mine is Bill Bonanno, the author, and a man with some experience in terms of organized crime. His father, of course, was Joseph Bonanno, the so-called godfather of the Bonanno family. And he talks about meeting Roy Cohn, who was an attorney that defended quite a few of these figures. And Cohen showed him photographs of Hoover in compromising positions, shall we say, and said this is the reason that J. Edgar Hoover will never go after organized crime.
Which is, when you really think of it, our hard-earned money is just siphoned off into organized crime, billions.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right off the top. So whatever he led us into was not the promised land. I'll tell you that.
May I mention this?
Sure.
I can tell you that, at least in my opinion, this is strictly a personal opinion, but if you compare the Hoovers, the Deloshes, the people of that ilk to organized crime figures, the organized crime figures start to look pretty good, because at least they have a code that they go by. Some of the savagery and viciousness that Neil Gallagher, for example, and Hale Boggs and many others were subjected to when they started to question experimentation on humans, American citizens, Canadian citizens, people locked up coming in to Allen Memorial Hospital, for example, in Canada for postpartum depression, being drugged with LSD and
this
Thorazine.
Was artichoke. This was the artichoke,
exactly.
Yes.
Thorazine, etc. Massive doses
sleep
of
deprivation.
Drugs, 37 days in a box with total sensory deprivation. I mean, these are incredible breaches of a trust that people should be able to have with their government. And so, if you look at a little history, like Churchill says, sometimes you have to look a long way back before you take a step forward. I think in terms of privacy these days, in the year 2002, before we're very accepting of every single thing, again, warrantless searches, profiling, etc., you should look a little back and see when guys like Hoover and Dulles and those kind of people had that power, had the absolute power. When people like Cardinal Spellman, a friend of Neil Gallagher's, an acquaintance through Roy Cohn, could say when people are using listening devices in confessionals. And Neil Gallagher, studying this for his privacy hearing, actually confronts Spellman, Francis Cardinal Spellman, about this. He says, you know, what do you think about this? And he says, look, don't worry about it. Mr. Hoover will take care of everything. He goes, this is a sacrament. How can you have even the possibility that the people that trust you are being spied on in confessionals and eavesdropped in confessionals? And the mentality was such, don't worry about it. Mr. Hoover knows what's best. Incredible.
And there's that constant whitewash that nothing in America could ever go awry. that I hear it when I talk to dear friends of mine. Why would they do that to us?
But Al, it has gone awry.
I know that, Ron.
The issue, in many ways, and occasionally you'll talk to somebody and they'll refer to something as a conspiracy. So let's say something along the lines of Oliver Stone's JFK, or any book that you want to read these days. As you start to get more and more information, and it trickles out after the years and years about the Kennedy assassination, or the many people that were assassinated associated,
sure.
Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, etc. Are these conspiracies? Well, I would say this. If people have a common goal, which is to suppress a certain point of view, and they get together and put an action plan, like a business person would, a business plan together on how to deal with it.
Right.
And by the way, you know that guys like Allen Dulles, for example, were in charge of assassinations out of Switzerland. And that was his job, was to coordinate assassinations and make it look like an accident.
And founding members of NSA, National Security.
Absolutely.
Foundation members of the CIA.
Absolutely.
OSS.
So,
let's just go on. How did Neil Gallagher become aware of this originally?
Yeah.
How was it first brought to his attention that people were being profiled in a certain fashion?
Well, I'm sure he would wish that this never happened in certain ways, because it brought him down a very dark corridor that probably to him seems like an endless one. But he was working late in his congressional office and moving into the lobby, and a woman confronted him, a mother and her daughter. And I want to see a congressman, she was screaming. And apparently her daughter had been polygraphed, was going for a clerk typist job
right.
with the federal government. And as a prerequisite for the job, she had to take a lie detector test, as everybody did in those days. And during the lie detector test, apparently, this relatively naive 17-year-old was asked by another 18-year-old, 20-year-old, let's say, without any real training, about her sex life, about her sexual habits, about things, her religious.
Nothing to do with the job.
Absolutely nothing. And so here's a woman, by the way, who had escaped Germany, and so was an immigrant. And she confronts this congressman who just happens to be there. Says, how in this country can a young girl like this be interrogated this way about her sex life, about her religion, about, I thought I left this behind in Europe. And Gallagher listens to the story and starts to investigate. And as he starts to investigate, he finds out that these polygraph tests are used not just by the State Department, where one would expect, or the CIA, where one would expect.
Right.
These are security, high security positions, but for just everything. And that these people that are giving the tests are totally untrained, and that these are a matter of permanent record.
Ron, it almost seems that the government in profiling like this is looking for the type of person that they can trust. Maybe they have deep, dark secrets within. Maybe they're looking for people who can be able to do things like liquidate somebody with an ice pick or something. Maybe they're looking for that. Maybe we've come to a point in our history that we are ruled by tyrants. Do you think that this is what some of the forefathers had warned against, a large central government?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And this is where I start to I take a half step back. The interesting thing about all of these things, the interesting thing about evil, is that it isn't something very dramatic. The people that really become evil, it's a process. It's a step-by-step thing, like they say about boiling water. You start it slow in a bathtub, and people don't feel it. They're numb to it. And as the temperature elevates, they can boil to death, but they'll never really understand that the
Right.
temperature rose.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way this is. So it isn't so dramatic as killing people with ice picks. Really what it is saying something like, a very good example, Werner von Braun. I make rockets. My job is to make sure they go in the air. Where they land, what they have in them, that's another department. But you put these departments together, and you have a scheme that becomes very nefarious. You have V-2 rockets landing on London.
Now you had mentioned about the psychological profiling and testing of school kids. I did not know until I read the manuscript that Ritalin has been given to children for a number of years.
Absolutely.
I thought it was maybe 5 or 6 years, maybe
No.
10 years.
No.
What was the reason for the gathering of this information, and were the parents aware that the government was sanctioning through the school systems these profilings of?
Well, again, it's you've got to look at it as part of a mosaic that forms a picture.
Sure.
And I remember when I was a kid, we took psychological tests. What I didn't know was that Neil Gallagher was the one that had them removed. But we, third, fourth grade, that kind of thing, would take psychological tests, and they'd have rather bizarre questions about religion, about your parents.
Parents' behavior.
Parents' behavior, about your sexual proclivities, about your parents' sexual strange questions. But really, what this became part of from the Office of Statistical Services was an FBI Army computer. And the idea was, and this was Hoover's invention, along with the U.S. Army, there's a lot of computer space at the time. And the idea was to have a dossier on every living American citizen. And the things that comprised that dossier would start with guys like me in the third grade filling out a 300, 400 question survey, psychological test. These things would be filed away. And the nefarious thing is, not that you have the test, because the test is just a test, but when you interpreted the test, psychologists would claim that they could see if someone was a homosexual. They could see if the parents had a deviant lifestyle, if they paid their bills, if they went to church. And this became, again, part of a profile that could be used later for blackmail, and was. And coercion.
It's there for the taking.
Absolutely.
I mean, who would it be? You'd have to really exercise some great restraint not to use that power any way that you chose to use it.
Part of those same databases, which they're talking about now again. I mean, everybody's talking about just yesterday, last night. I was listening to somebody, maybe it was Ellison from Oracle, talking about a massive linkage of computers. But in these things these days, you would have DNA tests, you would have buying habits, credit card bills, and
it's watching a drama.
It's amazing.
You can star in your own drama. The government can write the script, almost digitally compile a totally different life.
Sure.
Is this what they did to Neil Gallagher?
Yes, I would say that that's a fair representation. Basically, Neil, you've got to understand the mentality, I think. First of all, he's a very bright guy and a very perceptive guy. But this is not a man of the 90s. And I'm not so sure I look at the so-called man of the 90s as a great role model for anybody anyway. He's a principle-based guy, not a situational ethics guy. And you got to remember, if you're truly fighting for a cause against totalitarianism, in both cases, whether it be Nazism or communism, and that's your belief, this is a person with very strong and vigorous energies to throw at an issue.
Is what you admire about him most?
It's certainly one of the things I admire about him. What I admire about him most is his sense of fairness. That's what I admire about him most. He's the most fair man I've ever met.
Let's see. That was after meeting Neil, writing in his house, getting to know what he really stood for.
Mm-hmm.
If you had to sum it up, on what Neil told you, where do you think this is going to lead American society? Do you think our society will benefit by this?
Well, you know, earlier you'd asked about Ritalin and about various drugs. There are about 250,000 kids being tested with about 10 different drugs, most of the time unbeknownst to their parents.
Right.
And this was about productivity. They called them smart pills. And the idea was to test groups. So you would take a class and to split it. And 40 kids, 20 of them would take a particular drug. Again, unbeknownst to their parents in many cases.
Fascinating.
The other 20 would not. And they would clock scores. They would clock attentiveness and those kinds of things. In my own view, a lot of this is about productivity. A lot of that is about uniformity. It's expensive from a business standpoint, a global standpoint, to have a lot of ideas. It's expensive to have ties that are many different colors. It's very inexpensive to have a particular approach to things. One world, one system. And I think that's probably where it leads to. But what you lose in that kind of thing is a personal freedom, a sense of creativity, a sense of spontaneity, and these are true American values.
Wouldn't it also create the American hegemony and how the rest of the world would view that American hegemony?
I think so. I think that's correct. I also think that this is a way of competing, was considered a way of competing globally with other kinds of economies.
Must we embark on this journey to compete with the Chinese in the 21st century?
Well, I mean, we're in a capitalist society, so productivity matters. But I also think that societies can have nervous breakdowns, just like people.
Yeah.
And when I look at kids today, many of whom are on drugs, I look at a standard suburban town where I live, for example. I don't think you can go through a family, and not five, and not find 2 family members that are on some kind of psychotic medication for being overactive, not active enough, depressed, not depressed. It's a huge boon to the pharmaceutical companies, for one thing. But for another, it's a huge boon to productivity. But what's lost there is that children, in many cases, don't have the freedom to daydream, to be children, and to grow up in a natural environment that causes a balance.
And that is truly a shame. Ron, it looks like we're out of time, but I'd like you to continue our conversation next month. Good luck with the privacy war, Neil Gallagher and the Hoover-Kennedy vendetta. And I hope that people of good conscience will begin to take a serious look on what the loss of privacy could ultimately bring if left guarded only by the spin doctors. Please tune in next month to Alternatives for Part 2 as we continue to examine the issue of personal privacy and the abuse of personal data that can affect our security. My many thanks to author Ron Felber, Ellen Mulroy, and the Fair Lawn Access Facility for the use of their studio. My thanks to the OK TV crew working behind the scenes, and to you, our viewers watching at home. For Alternatives, I'm Al DiGiacomo.